Hello, this is Amin, and this is session 51 of ASP.NET Core MVC tutorial. In this session, we are going to talk about differences between the different add services methods, AddSingleton, AddScoped, and AddTransient in practice. If you remember, in session 16, we already discussed about these methods, and we explain all the methods that we can add the services inside the startup configure services method. And as you can see at Singleton, this method create an instance of the service once as per the request. Create instances available in whole life of web app and is the same in all the requests. We will see this explanation in practice, and also about AddTransient. This method creates an instance of the service each time they are requested. Thus, the instance is always new in the different requests. This method is suitable option for lightweight and stateless services. And about AddScoped, this method creates an instance of the service per each request. This instance is valid and same for all the requests, but it is different in another request. Let's flip to Visual Studio and talk about these three add services in practice in our web application. First, I need to add a static repository for category. I'm going to create a static repository for category, and as I explained it in the previous sessions, I don't explain more about this task, and as you can see, I just add a class inside the models, and I call it a static category repository. And of course, this repository should be implemented from iCategory repository. And then I implement the declared method. And I have just get all categories. I continue to implement a get all categories method. But before that one, I need to add some static data. I just copy and paste the static data. You can refer to the session which is related to repository and dependency injection for understanding this topic better. And as you can see, I just have a static data inside the underlying categories object. Next, I need to switch to the static repository for both cost and category. For this purpose, as I explained it earlier, I'm going to a startup and configure services method. And as you can see, both repositories are connected to SQL Server repository. And I just switch to a static repository. And here I switch to a static category repository. And I change these add services to AddSingleton. First, I check the AddSingleton, and I expect to have this object for whole the life of the web application, and the object of a static repository should be created once and it should be valid for whole the life of the web application. Also, I need to do some modification inside create.cshtml, which is create view. Here I need to count the number of the records in the static repository. Thus, for this purpose, I need to inject iCast repository inside this view, and I call it cost repository. Here, after the form, I just add a div, and inside that div, I use h2 tag. And inside the h2 tag, I'm using a cost repository. and I get all the cost, all the recorded cost, and I count the number of all the stored record inside the static data. Also, I'm going to cost controller, and I just disable the line which redirect my web application to index, because I want to stay inside the create form after creating each record. That's why I comment this line of code, and I save the project, and I build the project, and we'll check what I have inside this web application with these changes. The web application is up and running, and I'm going to cost list, and you can see I have the static data here, and I'm going to create new cost, and you can see the number of record is 3. I'm going to add another record, and I press create button, and you can see the number of record is changed to 4. I create another one, and you can see I have five records, and by each time of creating a record, you can see this number is increased, because the object of cost is created once when the web application is launched, and this object is valid for whole the life of the web application. If you can see, if I return to cost list, I have all the stored data here, and you can see if I'm going to another controller and return to this controller, I have this record again. This is the behavior of AddSingleton. Let's back to Visual Studio and change the add method to AddScoped. I'm going to a startup class and change these services to AddScoped, and now I want to use AddScoped. And now I expect to have the object of cost during the submitting a request, and in this situation I don't expect to have the object of cost for whole life of the web application. Let's run the project again and check the behavior of AddScoped. Project is up and running, and I'm going to cost list, and you can see I have all the static data, and I'm going to create new cost. And here I'm trying to add a data, a record of cost, and I press the create button. You can see now I have 4 records. Let's try to register more data, but you can see every time that I press create button, the number is still 4, because this object is valid for each request. And if I return to cost list, you can see I just have the record that I have inside the static repository, and we check with each other the lifespan of the object with AddScoped. And now we back to Visual Studio to check the behavior of AddTransient, and here I change it to AddTransient. I run the project again, and I'm going to cost list and create new cost. As you can see inside the description of AddTransient, this method create an instance of service each time they are requested. It means the validation and the life of the object of cost is just valid for the period of request, and after that the object will be terminated, and by each request I create another object of that item. Let's back to project and try to add the data. As expected, the number of record is still 3, and each time that I press create button, a new instance of cast repository is created, and after the submission, the object will be terminated. That's why I'm not able to add data to cast repository, because the life of object is limited to the life of the request. That's why for static data, the best option is add singleton. But when I'm using SQL Server, it is better to use AddScoped for adding the repository to web application, because when I use AddScoped, as we tried, you can see the object is valid for whole the scope and for whole the request. We have checked the differences between AddSingleton, AddScoped, and AddTransient. In the continuation of this session, I'm trying to add some data validation for the drop-down list that I have inside the web application. I'm going to change my form, create form and update form, same as this slide, and I want to add two item to drop down list of category and payment method, which you can see in the slide. And user should select one of the valid item from the drop down list, and if the user leave the form with these two options, which they are not valid option, they will receive a validation error. Let's flip to Visual Studio to implement these changes inside my web application. Let me stop the project, and here I use AddScoped as I explained, and I switch to SQL Server repository. Then I'm going to create view and remove this line that I added just for explaining the differences between AddSingleton, AddTransient, and AddScoped, and now I don't need this repository inside the view. Let me save the changes, and I'm going to cast controller, and again I active this line of code. As you can see here, I'm using category repository to get all categories, and then I add all the categories inside the cat list, which is list of selected list items. Then I pass cat list to the view with view back, and as you can see inside this view, I'm using ASP items for both category ID and payment method, and here I'm using this viewback to have all the items, and for payment method I use HTML.getEnum select list, which get all the enum elements of payment method, and I can see the element of payment method inside the drop down list of payment method. But I need to do some changes inside the cost controller to implement the data validation for these fields. First, I need to pass the posted data to the model, and if model state would be invalid and model state that is valid return false, I should return the posted data to the view to display the validation error. Now I need to add my option, which I show to the user to select the category, and I use cat list and add method, and inside that one I use new select list item, and inside that one I should pass a text which will be displayed inside the form, and the value I use select the category as a text, and I set the value of -1. I will show you why I select -1. First of all, we know that the value of this option should be invalid, and we will check the category table inside the database, and with the SQL Server Object Explorer, we can find that the -1 is not exist inside the database, and then if the user will select a category in the form and submit the form, we can realize that the user submitted an invalid option, and we can display the validation error for our drop-down list. And as you can see, the ID of the category is 1, 2, and 3. And if I add another categories, it would be the positive integer. That's why I use -1, which is, of course, invalid data. And if the user is select a category option inside the drop-down list, the user will receive the validation error. Then I need to have another list of selected list item for payment method, and there I need to add the option which is select a payment method, and it should have invalid data to convey the proper message to the user. For this purpose, I will create another list of selected list, and I call it payment list. As we already discussed about enum class and enum options, we know the index of each item inside the enum class is return an positive integer value. We can check it by reviewing payment method enum, and if we check cash, we can see its ID is equal 0 and debit is equal 1 and credit is equal 2. It means the web application and the form expect to receive an integer value, and here I add an invalid option for my drop-down list of payment. That's why I add an item inside payment list. And inside that one, I create a new selected list item, which will have an option. But this time, I'm using a null value for this purpose. And then I need to catch all the data inside payment methods. Now I need to create an object. I call it payment method. And then I use enum class and get values method. Then I need to use type of, and type of the enum that I want to restore, and I want to get all the elements. And as you can see, the IntelliSense complete the line of code, and just I need to change it to payment methods, and here payment methods. Then I need to change the results to list. That's why I use toList method as well. Now I have all the data, all the enums of payment method inside payment method value. Next, I need to add all the payment methods that I have inside payment method enum to my payment list. For this purpose, I'm using for loop. As we checked, the index of enum started from 0, and then I'm going one by one and increase the counter, which is I in this example, and until I reach to end of the list. And as you know, as I started from 0, I should go to the number of elements inside my payment method enum -1. Thus, I use I smaller than payment method count. Then I need to add element to payment list, and I create a new select list item, and I need a text to be displayed and a value that we return when we post the form. That's why I use payment method index I, and I convert it to a string, and also as a value I dot to a string. And here I should add open and close parentheses, and then semicolon at the end of the line. With this code, I would have all the payment methods plus the item which I added here, select the payment method, to payment list. Next, I need to pass this payment list to my view, and I'm using viewBag, and here I use viewBag, and I call it payment methods, and I call it to payment method list. Now I want to explain this part of code again. First, I catch all the categories and I store all of them inside the categories. Then I create a list of selected list item, which I call it cat list. And after that, I add the option that I want to have inside my drop-down list, which is select a category. Then with for each loop, I store all the categories that I receive from the category repository and add all of them inside the cat list. Then I pass cat list to my view with viewBag. For payment method, I create another list of selected list item, which I call it payment list. Then I add the item that I would have inside my drop-down list, which is related to payment method. And I again use add method, and I create a select list item inside the list, which its value is null and its text is select a payment method. Then I store all the payment methods that I have inside my enum with enum.getValues, and I use type of, which should be type of payment methods, and I cast all payment methods and I convert all the object inside payment methods enum to a list, and I store the list inside payment method. Now I have a payment method object which contain all the items of payment method enum. Next, I use for loop to add all the payment methods inside the payment list that I created here. Then I pass the payment method list to the view with viewBag method. As I should repeat this piece of code inside the HTTP get and HTTP post of create, and then I want to use it inside the update action method. I cut this code from here, and then I create a private method which I call it load dropdown list, and it's return a void and it doesn't have any result. And then I paste the code inside this method. Then I use load dropdown list method inside all the part that I want. And here I'm going to create with HTTP get, and I remove this piece of code, and I just use load dropdown list method that I created recently, and also inside the HTTP post of create. Here I use load dropdown list method again. Now I just implement these changes for a create action method, and then I will do the changes for update and edit action method later. Now I will have my form with the items. Let's first run the project to check what I have until now. And I refresh the page, And as you can see, I have selected category here, but here I still have the enum item and I don't have select a category. And if I press create button, you can see I don't receive any data validation here. Let's back to Visual Studio and implement the rest of the code that I should change inside the view. Now I'm going to create view. First, I need to add ASP validation for these two drop-down lists. And here I change it to category ID, and here I change it to payment method to display the data validation error which is related to payment method and category list. And here also I should change this line of code which gets enum selected list from the enum that I have. And again I use view bag and payment methods viewback. Now I expect to have both items inside the both of the drop-down list. Let me build the project again. And again, I submit the data. And here you can see I have the value is invalid, which data validation error, but I don't expect to have this data validation because I want to have a proper message, which should be, for example, select a payment method, and the payment method is mandatory. Also, I don't receive any validation error for category. Let me back to Visual Studio and do some changes inside create cast view model. As you can see, this model is using create cast view model, and inside create cast view model, here I should make payment method to a mandatory value. That's why I add required data validation for this one, and I use error message. Then I mention the error message that I want to be displayed if the user doesn't select a proper option. Also here, I expect if I receive -1 value, the form will convey a proper message. That's why I am using regular expression for category ID. And with the regular expression, I mentioned just accept the positive integer. Then I'm using regular expression. And here I should add the regular expression. I have already discussed about the regular expression, and if you are not familiar with regular expression, you can review the session which is related to regular expression. And I just copy and paste the proper regular expression that I want for receive just a positive integer. This is the regular expression that just receive the positive digits, and the error message would be please select a category. Let me save the changes and run the project again and submit the form again with invalid data. And you can see I received the proper message, which is please select a category for this part. But here, as I pass null value, and the null value is an invalid value for payment method, and it's expected to receive an integer value. That's why I should do another changes inside the create cast view model, and I make this payment method to the situation that receive null value. That's why I should add a question mark here, and with this question mark I mention that this property can even receive a null value. And also I should add this question mark to the cost model, because if I don't add it here, then inside the cost controller, and here that I add the data and payment method, which I transfer the data of model to the object of cost that I created, I will receive an error. Let me save the changes, and for proof this fact, here I remove this one and I save the changes and back to cost controller, and as you can see, I received the message which mentioned cannot implicitly convert type of payment method to payment method which doesn't have the question mark. And for solving this problem, as I mentioned, I should add question mark here and save the changes, and here you can see the error message is disappeared. Let me build the project again, and again I submit the form, and you can see this time I received the message that I expected. This option is mandatory. Please select a payment method. Let me submit a proper value, and here I select the bill, and here I select the cash and submit the form again, and as expected I successfully submitted the data. Let me implement these changes for update purpose. Now you can see inside the update I don't have the value here and here, and of course I don't have the data validation. Let's back to Visual Studio and implemented these changes for update purpose. And here, as I create a non-action method, I can use it several times in the different action method. And for update, I can use load dropdown list non-action method. And here for the gets part, I remove this line of code which is related to loading the cat list and category list, and I use DropDownList non-action method, and I pass the value with the view back again to update view. And here for the post part, I need to add model to view if the model state is not valid to display the data validation, and I don't need this part of code. And here I use dropdown list non-action method, load dropdown list. Let me save the changes and go to update view and add the ASP validation for these two drop-down lists. And for ASP validation for category ID, I use category ID, and for this part I use payment method, same as the changes that I have implemented inside the create view. And also here I should use again the view back which contains the list of payment methods. That's why again I use view back and payment methods view back. Let me save the changes. But here, as I'm using cost model, I should add the changes that I added to the create cost view, and I use this regular expression for category ID, and here I will convey the message with the regular expression. And also for payment method, I need to add data annotation which is required, and I paste it here. And now with these changes, I expect to have this data validation inside the update form and update action method. Let me build the project again for the ID 16. The amount is 300 and the category is 3 and payment method is cash. When I edit it, I have the data that I expect to have. But here, if I select a category or select a payment method and I try to submit the form, you can see again I receive the data validation message. But if I select a valid option and I try to submit the form, you can see the form is submitted. And now I implemented this data validation for the drop-down list that I have inside my web application. And you can see I successfully implemented this form, and you can see the changes that I need to implement inside view model and cost model. And this is the changes that I created inside the controller. I create a non-action method, which is load drop-down list, which catch all the required data and add them to the list of selected list item, and then I pass this to selected list item to the view with viewback. And here is the changes that I implemented inside the view. I add the span which contains ASP validation 4, and I display the validation error with these 2 lines of code. Thank you for watching this session. Don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channel and like our videos and send your idea through the comments. And don't forget to follow us on our social media for further videos. Once more, thank you for being with us.